Okay, everybody, hello. Today is April the 1st. It's April Fool's Day. It's also Easter Sunday. It's also the day when Mercury stations retrograde in Aries, which I have to admit is kind of interesting in itself for those three things to coincide. Um, and April Fools, I have to admit, I don't really have an April Fool's joke for you. However, the archetype of the Fool is obviously prominent in the tarot, and there's something about the Fool who is a little bit impulsive, maybe a little bit naive, maybe a little bit prone to just doing things without really thinking it through, and so it's a good time to be cautious about what you're doing and that kind of thing. However, I'm thinking my idea for today is actually more to do with the Jupiter Uranus conjunction in Taurus, which will perfect on the 18th of April. And I have been kind of contemplating this one for a while. And I have to say that today I'm just, even despite the fact that it's Mercury retrograde, despite this fact that it's April Fool's Day, I'm just going to embrace the basic foolishness of the situation and talk about some things that have to do with current events and politics, because I think it's relevant to the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. Where do I start with this? Well, one thing, recently I noticed, the algorithm was displaying in my news feed some astrologer who did a video about the farmer rebellion in Europe, or I think it was mainly Belgium where this was taking place. And I just took one look at this, the way the guy was, like, if you notice, one of the things I'm doing is I'm making pretty raw videos where I'm not really, sometimes I would, I don't know, I've been kind of just getting them out there without putting a lot of work into doing like thumbnails that look whatever. But the thumbnail, the guy had a big tractor and the guy was like, "Rise up!" It like really kind of like, it's kind of like, this guy looks like this guy is just using astrology for some kind of propaganda, right? But rather than just, I was kind of put off by it and I didn't watch it, and now, but I kind of got curious about it. And then, so I started trying to look for it on YouTube, and then I couldn't find it. So I'm kind of thinking, did this guy take it down, or did this video get taken down? And so I really, that's one, if anybody knows what video I'm talking about, and if it's still up, I guess you could post a link to it or something, or let me know. But that was one of the things I've already noticed a bunch of other astrologers talking about this topic, right? And, the thing is, I'm just going to preface this by saying that I am I'm not like a expert economist or political analyst. So take what I say with a grain of salt. I'm not like, I'm being very well get this wrong, right? There may be, but I just had this idea that I wanted to talk about in this, as pertaining to this. Now, the thing is, like, one of the things that this has to do with, there's a couple of factors, right? One factor is globalization. The other factor is, let's say, climate change and environmental concerns, and making the necessary changes for sustainability, that kind of thing, right? And with the whole problem about globalism is that if you have if you have free market with foods, then the foods you're eating may not come directly from your local. You ever heard of this thing about the macrobiotic diet, where it's like you're eating stuff that comes like 100 miles from your house. And I live in a rural area, where we produce we have our own agriculture, we produce our own fruits and vegetables and all this kind of stuff. Of course, there's seasonal stuff. There's also a lot of imported things that you can't grow around here because the climate has certain restrictions, right? But the thing is, if you have completely open, free market capitalism when it comes to the agriculture, your farmers could be in a situation where the farmers of your country are finding themselves incredibly poor because some other country is able to produce food at a cheaper price, and then people are so broke due to the economic circumstances that they're just going to buy the cheapest stuff. They don't care where it comes from, and then you complain because you're shit out of luck because you need to find a way to make your production cheaper to compete with other foreign countries, right? Now, in Canada, we have certain controls on our agricultural industry, and I have to admit that I'm mainly familiar with this because my mother, at some point in time back in the 70s, used to work in the agricultural industry, and her job was this kind of managerial thing about looking, like, you assess, you know how there's this whole supply and demand thing, right? That rather than letting free market capitalism just govern itself, you look at the population of your country and assess the demand for a certain product, and then you assess the supply of a certain product, and then you produce so that you set certain quotas so that you're producing to meet the needs of your own country. And then what you do is you can set up protective tariffs on the products from other countries. So if somebody is, maybe there's some other country where they have more exploitative labor practices, or they have different economic circumstances where they're producing really cheap products, and you can set taxes where the imported things are at a are not. Your own local farmers are not getting completely obliterated by cheap products from other countries, right? And then there's this other thing too, which this is actually cool, is that this helps to reduce carbon costs because you're not, you're eating things that you don't have to spend as much oil and gas to get the stuff from the farm to your house if the farm is just, in your local area rather than on the other side of the world, right? Now, the thing about, like, globalization, right, is that there's something interesting about globalization, because I've heard some astrologers talk about this idea, like, the idea of rather than fighting the thing that you are, rather than resisting some sort of model that you don't like, it's better to come up with a different idea of the way things can be done and promote that. And this comes from Buckminster Fuller, right? That Buckminster Fuller says, design the model of that you want to see in the world and put your energy into that rather than fighting some thing that you don't like, right? But what I find is interesting is that Buckminster Fuller was also a globalist, right? Buckminster Fuller thought that if we had a perfect system of global capitalism, it would eliminate the problem of scarcity because everybody would have access to what they need in the most efficient way possible, right? Now, there are certain problems when it comes to this, because there are, when it comes to, like, food production, there are certain problems in, for one thing, let's say you can make a lot of food quickly and efficiently using a certain type of fertilizer, but then that fertilizer has the effect of depleting the soil in the long term and making it not sustainable. Right? So there's certain things like that where it's kind of, or what's another, and so there's one of these things is that these protests are what they're around are not. They're not. This is kind of confusing to me because they don't tend to be protests that are fighting or against the globalism, right? They're not fighting the free market and asking for protective tariffs. What they want is they want access to cheap fertilizers that they can use to produce more food more cheaply to compete with. And then this is the kind of thing in, like they talk about in Marxism, this thing about how, if you have a bakery that everybody likes and it gets bought out by capitalists, and then what they try to do is find a way to make the same product with cheaper ingredients and basically try to cut as many costs as possible so they can make more profit. And then what ends up happening is you end up with a really cheap product that eliminates all the things people liked about it in the first place. And this is what people call enshittification. In this, they've also applied this idea to certain things on the internet, where you have some good thing, but in order to make it more profitable, you make it more shitty, and we end up with this shitty capitalist thing that nobody really likes, right? What's interesting too is there's another side of this, that the companies that profit off of making things like cheap fertilizers, if you have environmentalist policies where they're trying to wean the system off these things and try to do something that's more sustainable, they're obviously going to get hit by this and they're going to lose money. And then but they're already rich, so they have a lot of money to put into things that are like think tanks to be like, how do we make it so that we can use PR to make people think that that this is what is messing with our local farming, rather than and taking this idea of but we don't question free market capitalism, which basically is globalization, which basically is why your market is overrun with cheap products and your own fellow countrymen don't stand a chance against the menace of the foreigners who have cheaper products than you, right? There's another thing about this. What I'm trying to say, the doing things more and more and more cheaply, but you're cutting into the actual quality, is that, and it may appeal to people who who want to avoid things like hormones, like beef that has hormones, all these cows that are hooked up to hormones and antibiotics and stuff like that in these factory farming situations, is that in Canada we have controls so that, like, for example, our dairy industry and our beef industry is completely like hormone free, antibiotic free, and so we have this thing so that we can set certain controls through government regulations on our meat and our dairy, so that when if the products from America are produced more cheaply, but they're also if that kind of bugs you, the idea of having meat and dairy that's all laced with, like, you got cows all jacked up on hormones and antibiotics, well, you have some control over that, right? But like, there's a certain kind of ideological rhetoric around freedom, right? That people like, oh, this is just big government trying to mess with our farmers' freedom and stuff like this. But it's kind of like, you have to like kind of look at how this has been. There's like, for me, there's so much bullshit out there that it should be pretty simple just to say, like, put it out, try to. I'm just saying this because I don't really see anybody talking about this side of it in terms of these kinds of issues around supporting your local farming industry and all this kind of stuff, and protection against globalism and all that. Okay, and while I'm on this topic, there's been a number of things, or like this general thing about, there's like the protests that are happening, and in relation to this thing about, I'm thinking about globalism and relating it to this sort of like Jupiter-Uranus thing that's kind of like Buckminster Fuller, and Jupiter has this kind of quality that wants to like tie everything together, and like the whole world is like one thing, and all governed by the same providence of Zeus, the king of the gods, and all this, right? And there's a sort of like kind of electric charge going on with the Jupiter Uranus, and in Taurus very much has to do with these issues of agriculture, obviously, right? There's this whole thing about the where am I going with this now? I have a few other ideas about this. Also relating to this thing about high oil and gas prices and the general kind of discontent around austerity economy, right? And I also just want to say, one of the things that I find interesting about this thing about globalism and the protest kind of side of it is that there's something that you have to understand. I'm not really into the idea of nationalism as opposed to globalism by any means. I think patriotism is kind of whack, to be honest. I don't know if that's more of a Canadian perspective. Maybe Americans kind of relate to the whackness of patriotism, but there seems to be more of a thing with America, right? But and there's also kind of interesting is that a while ago there was this trade war with Donald Trump, right? And Donald Trump's like anti-globalist trade war isn't to like, well, I don't know, we're not going to get into that. Donald Trump is actually tends to be actually not so much about free trade. Donald Trump uses all sorts of tariffs to try to levy America's position, right? Where it's sort of like trying to protect yourself against the cheap products from other countries, meanwhile trying to push your own cheap products on other countries, right? So like if we can get other countries to buy our cheap shit, that's good for us. But if we have other countries' cheap shit competing with ours, then that puts our producers at a disadvantage, right? So you get into those kind of like trade war things, and that was going on during the Trump years. And I found it interesting because there were a lot of Canadians during those years. Like, this is one of the things that I was I have to admit that part of this whole dynamic has to go with the fact that I am living with my family, who tend to be like maybe a bit more centrist, liberal. They're not really the thing is, like, my family are pretty left, but they're not like crazy Marxist communists. My sister may dye her hair funny colors, but if she was she's not really, they're pretty far cry from like these sort of like, if you hang out in like leftist spaces online, what the really hardcore leftists are like, it's not really like that, right? I don't know, where am I going with this? The thing about protests, though, right? Anyways, is that there have been, there were these protests where they had the Canadian trucker thing back during the COVID years, but what they were protesting was basically had to do with border policy, right? And it also had to do with basically vaccine requirements and stuff like that. It didn't really have to do with the whole thing about, like, let's say, farmers not being able to compete. This is truckers for one thing. And what was interesting is recently, like, you saw the image of all the people blocking traffic with their big tractors and agricultural equipment and doing this big protest in Europe, right? But in Canada, we haven't had any of that at all. I mean, we do here. We are suffering from high gas prices, and it's been announced that, for one thing, it's been announced there was this thing that got leaked. There was a document that got leaked from the RCMP where they were predicting that the economy, in terms of things like high gas prices and austerity and stuff like that, is only going to get worse over the next 5 years. And personally, as an astrologer, I can kind of see this going with the Saturn and Neptune conjunction. Like Saturn is kind of like the planet of austerity, of being kind of stingy, of being kind of poor, being kind of, you gotta pinch your pennies, you gotta cut costs, you gotta do, right? And that also, like I mentioned in my other video, it's really interesting that the Communist Manifesto was written under Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, which is the exact placement we have right now, right? But you know what's kind of funny is that I remember in the news not that long ago, in Canada there was a lone guy on a tractor who took his tractor onto the highway, and he was going to like be he's going to try to bring his tractor to a protest, but the protest didn't have anything to do with farming, right? It didn't have anything to do with farming or the farmers not being able to compete in a global market. I mean, it could be because we have these Canada has a different sort of policy with our agriculture, as I was saying. What this guy was doing was he was going to take his tractor to protest teaching like gender theory about, like, you know, having education around transgender stuff and in schools, right? And for one thing, the whole issue around trans politics and queer politics doesn't really have a lot to do with farming, right? It doesn't really have a lot to do with oil and gas prices. They're kind of separate things. And so there wasn't really like a big mass movement of people with big tractors protesting this, because for one thing, it doesn't really make sense. And then second of all, the one guy who did do this got chased by the cops on the highway and ended up trying to get away from them and flipping his tractor over, making it kind of an embarrassing news story. But where am I going with this? There's this thing, what I've noticed anyways, is there's a certain kind of rebellious element in Canada that sympathizes in some way with the plight of the European farmers who are in a different country, who are basically getting fucked over by a free market capitalism. But the thing is, in Canada, we don't actually have that problem. And there's this whole thing about people who don't like Justin Trudeau. And I have to admit, you know, I don't like Justin Trudeau very much either. But when you try to listen to what these people say about Justin Trudeau, they don't really have anything coherent to say, right? And one of the things, like, I was getting in my algorithm feed, there's this guy, you know, I mean, you know, there's a certain thing, I also have to admit, there's something going on with the Pisces stellium right now, with Mars and Saturn. Venus is exalted in Pisces, which makes it a bit better. But this Mars, Saturn, Venus, Neptune stellium in Pisces, I've noticed has the quality of just being like a hot dumpster fire, right? And it's like, if you can smell the noxious fumes of the shitty dumpster fire, sometimes it's better just to like avoid it. And I've been kind of like avoiding this for a while. And I kind of have this built-in thing, like maybe I don't want to go there, but there's what I'm trying to get at the Buckminster Fuller thing is like where you're supposed to, instead of reacting to something you don't like, you're supposed to model what you do like, right? But I kind of have this sense that there's like, these people are kind of incoherently reacting to this thing about globalism, but the reaction itself is actually a kind of globalism, right? Because the people, the farmer, the unrest in Canada, I mean, if people were going to be upset about high oil and gas prices, then that makes sense. But, or like, this whole thing about like, you're going to show solidarity with the farmers or the or like we have this media system where you have a certain people that have a certain political alignment that we're going to be like, it doesn't matter if these people are in the EU, it doesn't matter if these people are in Canada, it doesn't matter if they're in America, it doesn't matter if these are poor Indian farmers, because there have been Indian protests around. I mean, that Indian farmer thing has been going on for a long time, right? From a globalist perspective, instead of actually looking at what's going on, you just sort of ball all this stuff together, right? And I think it's a kind of a thing you have to watch out for if you're an astrologer, because you might just be like, oh, Jupiter, Uranus, Taurus, it's like all around the world, the farmers are getting fucked over, right? And so it's just one thing, and we got to show solidarity for our brothers in the other country and all this kind of stuff, and not be isolationists, nationalists, and all this, right? But like that is like, in some way, it's like you're kind of like the mass movement of like protest and unrest is kind of incoherent because it has more to do with something going on the other side of the world than the actual situation you find yourself in. And then when you actually apply those principles to the political situation in your own country, which is not the same as a political situation in another country, what you end up is something that's completely incoherent, where you've got one lone guy in a tractor trying to protest trans issues that have nothing to do with agriculture or farming or austerity, right? And it's like absolutely nuts, right? And the whole thing is that this is like, it's not really a conspiracy, right? But there's something about like politics and the media and the conversation that we have around this is like, this is the whole thing about postmodernism, about how like there's kind of thing like, I was watching this I have to just also say that there are certain things that I'll just go and say it, that there was this good, I mean, I don't know if it was good or not, but well, I still enjoyed it. I thought it was worthwhile. There's this video that came out recently where the guy from Rune Soup did a video where they were analyzing this Jordan Peterson interview from last year. I mean, I have to admit, this also kind of played into some of the stuff that I was talking about idealism and materialism, and they were talking about whether or not Marxism is Gnostic, right? If there's some sort of mystical Gnostic Marxism or something like that. And the thing about this is that, like, I kind of have this thing going where there's something about the Rune Soup crowd that I may not come to the same conclusions as these guys, but there's something about the conversation that I still find is like worth listening to, and so I can appreciate the content they're making. But I have my own, I have my own view on things, and I'm not saying that, maybe I'm making some error in the way that I'm judging this or the way that I'm putting this together or something like that. But like my father, who passed away, one of the things I always remember about him is that there's this whole thing about like whether you're your politics just come from your own circumstance of like how you're conditioned in, like, and I was raised by parents who are explicitly leftist, right? And there's this kind of thing though of like, this is what I was trying to kind of approach earlier a little bit, is that my family was explicitly leftist and raised me in a certain way. But my dad, despite this, he had a business and he was inclusive of all sorts of people and of different people. But what he liked to do was listen to right-wing talk radio, which I feel like all this stuff that has turned into like Donald Trump and the alt-right and all this kind of stuff. My sister has, or like not just that, but there's a certain thing that I run into where I'm, I've been, since COVID, I've been doing this thing where I've been a bit socially isolated. I haven't been going out much, I have to admit. But one of the obstacles I have with trying to go out and find my place in a community or something like that is that I, the idea of having a political alignment and having like a social group that you're part of, right? I have to admit that I have some desire to be part of some sort of social group and not just be an isolated schizo that doesn't have anybody he hangs out with. But what I run into is that, like, I was living on Vancouver Island, and as I mentioned in my last video, there's a lot of like crazy shit that goes on in Vancouver Island, and in some way my losing the place that I was living and coming back to the mainland and living with my family, I kind of consider that to maybe be a kind of graceful thing that happened. I kind of liked the idea of hanging out in Vancouver Island, but I was running into this thing, the certain crowd that was there, where my sister has a certain word that she uses to describe it. She uses the word wackadoos, right? And there's this kind of thing that, like, people that are closer to the urban center in the mainland may have a different kind of center of gravity, but then when you get out into the interior or into the country, and then there's this thing that happened in Kelowna recently with the RCMP, or I don't know if it's the RCMP in Kelowna, but the police are being very tight-lipped. There was a SWAT team that there's a huge like tactical police thing, and they're not seeing anything about it. But Kelowna has this reputation of being full of all these people with really, anti-vaxxer. And my family basically sees all these people as just being wacky people, right? Whereas if I'm living on Vancouver Island and I'm hanging out trying to socialize, those wacky people are the peer group, basically, right? So I'm kind of like, what's better or worse here? To put myself in a situation where there's all these wacky people or that I'm with my family who are a bit more centrist, a bit more liberal. But the thing is, I'm open-minded. But I don't want to be like living with my family and consuming all this media, which then drives a wedge between me and my family, because I'm more open to what the wacky people are like. But then when I found I was actually really immersed in that kind of situation with that kind of peer group, I don't know, man. I was kind of like, man, maybe I don't vibe with these people, right? But what I'm trying to say is that I think there's something to be said for this idea that community and socialization doesn't have to be the same thing as a political in-group, and that you can have society may be better if instead of with the Mars-Saturn thing that I've noticed, that there's this tendency with Saturn being like a wall and Mars being the cutting thing, and there's this certain there's this thing that's like that I'm noticing that's happening on the Mars-Saturn conjunction, that being like, which side are you on? Choose a side. Don't just be like, Humpty Dumpty sitting on top of the fence who's gonna fall off, right? You gotta choose which side you are on, and then put yourself in alignment with that. Find yourself an in-group of people that will surround you and support your idea, and then create an echo chamber, and then the two of you will go to war against each other, right? Rather than but I think there's something, like, you could have a different model of this, where you accept the fact that community and social belonging isn't necessarily the same as a political in-group, and then you can have a group of people you can have a group of friends where different people have different political alignments or different political points of view, but then rather than being like at war with each other, you can be like, oh, hey, Joe, have you seen the stuff Joe's been posting on the internet? He sounds like he's getting kind of like going down like the weird rabbit hole of crazy shit. Maybe we could go and hang out with this guy and have a talk with him and sort of like try to, not let him get pulled into this sort of black hole of crazy bullshit, and we can sort of keep him in our community and sort of be like, hey, maybe not go that direction, buddy, right? And but the thing is, there's this thing about I've been thinking about reading some Hannah Arendt, but I haven't gotten around to like getting started with that yet. I haven't ordered any of her books, or I haven't started reading. But Hannah Arendt had this idea that was it totalitarianism or political extremism? Is that it operates on this principle of making everybody feel lonely and isolated and disempowered. And then in order to overcome this loneliness and isolation and disempowerment and fragmentation, people have to join up with some kind of a mass movement, right? And the mass movement gives them this sort of sense of solidarity, because basically it's a bunch of people that are from. But the thing is, what's funny is when it's on the internet, it's not really that you're not in solidarity with your neighbors, you're not in solidarity with your family, you're not in solidarity with the people in your community, you're in solidarity with a bunch of people who have fallen for the same wacky ideology around the world, regardless of what the local geopolitics in your region are. And then when you try to what ends up happening is that, I mean, for better or worse, these mass movements don't actually have very much political power, and they're kind of incoherent, right? Because it has more to do with, like, for example, there was this guy who was making a video that was like, showing about how upset people were with Justin Trudeau, but he was using people protesting the war on Israel to make a point about, like, and trying to like swing it in some sort of direction that didn't necessarily have anything to do with the war in Israel, right? Or that like there's a sort of like general animosity against Justin Trudeau, but when it comes to actually pinpointing what the problems are, it kind of just turns into like, well, he's gay, man. Like, it's like the same. We're going to take our tractors out to go protest like education about trans issues. And then when it comes to actual issues about globalization and what do you guys think about the free market economy or having protective tariffs do you like Donald Trump? Do you want to have hormone and antibiotic milk, or are you a person who's more into like the organic stuff, right? There's a certain thing where it becomes the Trump's advisor who Steve Bannon had this idea of flooding the zone with shit, and it's sort of like by interacting online, by having a but rather than having a embodied, in-person, local community thing, we have a bunch of people that are completely isolated, completely separated from their community, which makes them angry, which makes them alienated, which makes them feel disempowered, and then they fall for some bogus like ideology online, which makes them gives them some sense of being some strong, tough guy who is going to stand up to the there are shitty politicians or whatever like this, right? And it's like, but it's completely, you're doing it in a way that's rigged to be just inundated with tons of bullshit, right? And it's like actually, I don't understand why it's so difficult to just tell it how it is, right? But the fact that certain there may be certain vested interests that will put a lot of money into skewing things a certain way so that things don't change, right? And like there's the idea too with like, the different things that are expensive and austerity and all this kind of stuff. Like we might have controls over agriculture where we can like assess the supply and demand and make that so that our farmers are doing well with their businesses and that people have enough access to food and stuff. But when it comes to like real estate and housing, there's a bottleneck, right? Where we have a huge demand for housing, a very small supply, and because of this, landlords can charge whatever they can just make it, the sky is the limit, so that people don't have any money to spend on anything other than paying the bills and the cost of living. And then there's no, this is what people call the end of capitalism, right? Because in order to have a, you need to have a little bit of extra to go spend on this thing or that thing and not live in complete austerity, right? And like, because you've got these sort of systemic bottlenecks, which people who have vested interest in keeping things the way they are exploiting. And that's just how it is, right? And we have, in order to prevent that, for anybody from having an ability to change that, you have to have a political landscape that is completely alienating, where people are basically just acting out a sense of loneliness, alienation, and frustration in a way that's completely incoherent. And that is it. And I honestly don't think that talking about fascism makes any sense, because fascism, I think we can keep fascism as this thing that happened with Mussolini and Hitler and Franco back in the early 20th century. But there is this sort of the play where stupid, angry people are easy to take advantage of, right? And you have a vested interest in keeping people stupid, angry, alienated, and feeding them a bunch of bullshit, and then creating a conversation that deteriorates into a bunch of meaningless nonsense, right? And so I just wanted to, with April Fool's Day, maybe it's foolish to just try to like go in there and tell it how it is, but this is just what's been on my mind around this stuff. I think I've done a pretty good job of explaining what was on my mind for this video. So, yeah, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, tell your friends. And yeah, stay tuned for more, you guys. All right, thank you very much.